it now. Recording in progress, it says reassuringly. So I should also thank various people who've helped us put this together. So our sponsors, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and the Arts Council in Dublin and Belfast City Council. And I should also thank Photo Museum Ireland, who've helped us co-host this event, as with previous events. I should say a little bit about this issue. The issue is the emotion issue. And in preparation for this, I went to a children's birthday party this afternoon, and I think I'll be hard pressed to match the emotion that was on expression there today. But maybe this evening, we'll learn a little bit more about what was going on. There are also quite a lot of pictures taken, of course. But in this issue, you will find out about cat photography, including a photograph for the first time of a very beautiful cat that belongs to me and is going to be getting its dinner in half an hour. You will find out about, you'll see portfolios of pictures by Vibke Lester and Colin Gray, which I highly recommend. There's some very interesting reviews in this issue. There's a sort of roundup review of recent books about French photography. And what else have we got? Oh yes, for those of you who've been watching the Tour de France, there is an excellent interview with John Pearce, who's a professional cycling photographer who tells you what it's like to photograph the Tour de France. So there's a very wide range of things in this issue, and I think it's a belter. But the one of the main highlights is an essay by David Bate about emotion in photography. And we're going to be talking to David in a minute and learn a little bit more about his essay and hope to hopefully expand on the subject. I should mention a couple of other things. You can get the magazine now, obviously, in shops, or you can get a copy sent to you by subscribing or buying an individual copy via our website. But there's also in this issue the booklet for the graduate photography online, the BA photography from this year, and it's a particularly strong year, I think. And if you're an MA student, the deadline for submitting work for the MA booklet is the 6th of August. So this is a time to get things together. And I should also mention, we seem to be coming down with opportunities this issue, that the Writers' Prize will again be running this year, and the deadline to submit work for the Writers' Prize is the 1st of August. So you will soon be able to look at various of the submissions from previous years on our website. You can see some of the previous years at the moment. But if you want to send us 700 words of original writing and to bring your writing to our attention, then please send us something before the 1st of August. It's free, amazingly, but the magazine costs £8. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to talk to David. David, would you like to say hello?
To unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and Richard and Source for inviting to do this event on a sunny evening in July. I'm not in a pub, I'm in the University of Westminster boardroom, or one of them, in the middle of Oxford Circus, main London campus. So that's excellent. So the great and good of the university behind me.
So we've been talking about the subject of this piece, emotion in photography, for quite a long time. And it started off as a sort of speculative conversation in an environment not unlike the one you're sitting in. And we were talking about why emotion is not a subject that's often discussed. So maybe you could start, David, by telling us why you think it's an interesting subject for a discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's really important for probably 3 or even 4 reasons. Firstly, because the more that photographs are used on camera phones, the more the images become used to express sort of subjective states. And I think we probably all recognize that. It's not just to document the place that you're at, it's also to sort of say something about it. And that expressive capacity of it has been kind of accelerated through both mobile phones and the internet. And it's pretty obvious that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years. Secondly, because there's a much stronger interest in emotions in digital economies. And this is also to do with AI softwares being able to recognize human emotions, but also more sophisticated dynamics. And this is related to the idea of sort of a emotional capitalism. I'm sure you're all aware in workplaces where everybody is much more sensitive to people's feelings and so forth. And in a way, this is part of what has been called emotional capitalism. In a sense, human emotions has become integrated much more clearly into structures of the economy. So people's well-being is linked to being sort of efficient, emotional stability, and so forth. And so cognitive psychology is linked to both pharmaceutical companies and scientific projects around image recognition and these kinds of things. So there's been quite a bit of work going on in digital economies there that relate to kind of visual systems. And then thirdly is that photography theory itself and photography practice specifically in art, it's very clear that, well, firstly, photography theory has completely neglected this for some time, and probably a lot of other things as well. But it seems to me there's a huge void where there should be discussions of this, as there are in other fields around visual culture and so forth. I mean, hate speech, for example, all the movements that we've seen in the last few years, emotions are central to those issues. So it's got to be, it ought to be discussed, it's got to be discussed. And so, I mean, a lot of the work for that had been done in art history to some extent, but not translated into photography. So 1970s, 1980s photography theory was quite concerned with beauty and to some extent pain and issues of desire, but never got round to kind of the classical emotions, really. So it seemed to me, I've been thinking about this for a long time, that there's kind of a void of these different areas in discussions around photography.
I think maybe we can show some pictures. So we were talking about this in the before, when we first started discussing this. I shan't say where we were talking about it, but and I think it's very easy to assume that you are dealing with something that is sort of eternal. That when we're talking about emotions, we're talking about the same things that would have been experienced by people and exhibited by people 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. And you were talking about these Kodak adverts as a way of,
yeah, I mean,
well, this isn't something that's always been the case.
No, it's a kind of an obvious way into it, that if you think about your experience of looking at 19th century photographs, people generally look pretty miserable until, you know, the late 19th century, when Kodak and other companies, of course, also started to promote this sense of the holiday encounter, the members of the family smiling, and this notion of sort of happiness as a physical expression on the surface of the body, as a way, you know, if you like, this is the beginning of a kind of modern era that photography is fundamentally responsible for. If you go back in art history I mean, there are some paintings in the article to make this point, that in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th century, people who were in agony, i.e. Christ on the cross, or the Madonna, typically didn't really express emotions on their face. So this is a relatively modern concept. And it's still not a universal concept in all cultures that when you greet someone, you should smile. So in a sense, Kodak is a sort of marker of that transition. It's also, I suppose, a kind of cliche now in talking about photography. You know, I mean, the words the expression "say cheese" was invented because of the way that it makes the muscular part of the mouth express what seems to be a smile. So it was years ago, I was amazed that in France, for example, they said "say cheese" because it had the same effect. They wouldn't say fromage because it actually makes your mouth not suitable for that expressive feature of the smile. So it's a kind of benchmark of that era when, if you like, the consciousness of your emotions comes to the surface in popular culture. And from then on, in a way, the selfie is inherited this, right? That you take a picture of yourself on holiday smiling, not necessarily, but there's a legacy of this, that the camera itself is being responsible for modifying sort of physiological expression of the person, that it must be expressed on the exterior. And that then leads into this contemporary problem that we have, is we tend to judge people on their expressions and assume that their interiority is somehow related to their external expressions. And that's quite complicated area, and it's, in a way, what I was sort of interested to start to try and unpick that kind of thing. So
I think once we started talking about this, I think it becomes clear that although people are familiar with seeing emotions expressed in photographs, and I think maybe I think this is probably the first image I thought of when I was thinking of images being expressed, just because we've got a copy of this catalogue in the office, and it seems clear what emotion is being expressed, and it's also representative of a lot of photojournalism, that you see people for example, in distress, and it seems like that's one of the things that photojournalism is going to do. But anyway, you're talking about emotion in photography. What I immediately thought of was, well, we're talking about people exhibiting emotions in photographs, but actually there's a lot more to unpick than that. So this picture, is this what you were thinking of when you first started thinking about emotion in photography, as in the way that you're talking about?
Kind of. I mean, you just reminded me of the famous newspaper editor motto, which is, "If it bleeds, it leads." I'm sure you know it as an editor.
Yes.
I'm sure you don't subscribe to it, but the idea of blood on the street is what sells. That happiness sells in certain contexts, but more specifically pain here, or it's a classic Pieta, right? In a way, is what we love in newspaper stories, is the agony of existence. And that sounds awful to make it sound like a kind of convention, when there is so many awful things happening in the world. But that is indeed the kind of economy that newspapers work with quite explicitly. So I think of this as a kind of a good example of the convention of the expression of emotion. But we have no idea what that woman is thinking or feeling, right? So there's this sort of slight disjunction. The fantastic Diane Arbus picture of girl crying. It's easy in a way to get caught up in the emotion of the person, so that we feel we have a kind of human almost embodiment of the same feeling that they have. Oh, that's terrible. So we say that, this is quite painful to look at, but there's also something in that that is kind of quite complex. I mean, perhaps the more difficult example is where charities, and I have talked to charity picture editors, where they say, when there is a catastrophe, the dying baby, despite all of the ethics, the dying baby picture is what brings in the money. And they're thinking about the emotional, well, maybe they're not thinking about it, but or paying attention to it in a way, that the act of charity for a picture of someone in deep pain, what does that do for the spectator? Maybe I'm preventing myself feeling pity by contributing money. So, the very complicated, and I'm not in a way critiquing that sort of dynamic, but charities are enmeshed in these complicated politics of emotions and the expression of emotions, because they are triggers for very specific spectator and audience reactions, which is what they want. And as photographers, we, I include myself, ought to be kind of much more conscious of these systems that are operated in existing media, cinema, television, social media, advertising, as part of our self-education as practitioners, to be aware of those conventions, but also the power structures that are invested in them as well. I think those things are really quite important.
I think when we started talking about this, we were talking about how the emotion as exhibited by somebody, the subject of a photograph, may or may not connect with the emotion that the person who's looking at the picture feels, or what is intended to be conveyed. And we ended up talking about this picture. And I think, in a way, the title of the piece is "Where is the Emotion in Photography?" And the purpose of your essay in the magazine is to try and clarify how emotion works in photography and the audience's relationship to photographs and a photographer making a photograph. It's almost a difficult challenge to just locate where emotion is actually present in this exchange between the photographer and the work and the person looking at a picture. So do you think that we can talk about emotion in relation to this photograph in the way that we could so easily with the two previous examples?
Yeah, completely. I mean, if you've got a human body, right, you can use the body, or the photographer will try to imagine the body is expressing the features, or the emotive structure that they're interested in. So you wait for the person to move and so forth. All that, like these portraits behind me of Great and Good of the university. But there are, of course, a picture that has no one in it, then you're relying on the other aspects of photography. When semiotics would call it a code, right? Monochrome. I remember this print being slightly more contrasty than this one. But the absence of human presence also speaks itself of a kind of absence, right? So one might identify oneself being as being in the place, as with the camera. So you identify with the position of the camera in the picture, but then also, well, it's empty. And one can speculate whether that is what the photographer themselves also felt at this moment with the camera on the tripod. I forget who's the spy. It's
Frederick Evans.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it's called The Sea of Steps, and it's Wells Cathedral.
Wells Cathedral, right? Yeah.
It was taken in 1903.
Thank you. And it's a very beautiful sort of almost musical image because of the repetition of the lines. But there's a kind of haunting emptiness, no doubt, echoed by the the open door and so forth. It's maybe harder to sort of work at teasing out which parts of the photograph are doing the work to make me feel this way. This is the sort of question we might, do in a photography courses, ask this about a picture. How is it doing its work? Because if you can understand that, then you can, well, also manipulate it, but also be clear about what you're doing with the picture.
I think lots of people might say that they found this picture moving, as a way of acknowledging that it was a picture that provoked an emotional response. But what would be your guess as to what the emotion was that it provoked? Do you think you could say what that was?
Yeah, well, it's a sea of steps, right? The title.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and if you look at the lines, they look like kind of waves, particularly I'm pointing it here, you can't see, you're pointing at the back. So you think of the idea of being at sea, then this is kind of associative logic, then being at sea where you're adrift, maybe not quite stable environment. There's some of you might think this is a flight of fantasy. It's kind of what we do, right? It's associative in a sense. But there's something that makes me feel slightly removed. I mean, it's very clear in the structure of the picture. These very powerful vertical lines that enforce the sort of rigidity of the architecture, and then the soft light on the steps that look kind of wave-like, sort of very unstable. So it's got a very clear contrast between the verticals and the horizontals. So yeah, it's coming from that, but exactly what that is, and maybe this is the character of, I won't say true art photographs, but art photographs that stick around in your mind are often ones where it's difficult to summarize the emotional state. So advertising pictures are very clear because they know they've only got a few seconds to get your attention and your emotion. Driving down the car on an empty road, yeah, got it right, and then bang, it's over. With art, it's tend to be much more, well, I'm not quite sure, like you said, I'm moved by this, but I don't know what I'm moved towards or from. So it's not within language. And I think that's, this is also one of the problems, is as soon as we start to talk about emotions in pictures, we're trying to verbalize them. We're trying to give it almost like a psychologist would get someone to express their inner feelings. So it's quite a difficult process to actually say what the mood is, or the characteristic is. I mean, I've always thought that all photographs have a kind of a mood, regardless of whether they have human expression in them. And that mood is something that we then relate to in, again, complex ways. Maybe we agree with it or we don't agree with it, and we hate it, or we identify with it, we feel it embodies something about ourselves. And I think that relates very clearly to the article on cats, I think. That cats are this sort of surrogate for not people, but kind of expressive emotional states. And it's very easy to kind of relate to cats in that way. It's the most popular creature on the internet.
So looking at this picture, we first of all looked at a photojournalistic picture in the Diane Arbus picture, in which there is a person there, and we can see that they're in an emotional state, and we might connect with that. And now we're looking at a picture that has no people in it, but we can still feel an emotion towards it. And this is your essay is explaining the how location may be located in this place. The component that we haven't talked about is what the photographer has done in what the role they have in putting emotion into a photograph or conveying emotion. But do you think that you would say something about what Frederick Evans has done something that is contributing to me feeling something when I look at this picture?
Yeah, this is, again, I think complicated because, and the reason for separating out these three things in the essay, the representation of emotions, just to rehearse this in a sense now, which is the representation of emotions in a culturally conventional sense, and those are not universal. They're articulated through, particularly visually, through different visual systems, as I said, like cinema and so forth. They're kind of conventional, yet they're always sort of shifting. Then the effect or affect that talked about in relation to this, that a picture might have an affect. And I noticed someone put a question about time. And of course, when Evans photographed Wells Cathedral, it was already old. So time would just change its relation to those feelings of maybe loss or emptiness or other feelings of being adrift. It's a component of that, actually. But the third thing of, if you like, not exactly the emotional state of the photographer, but a kind of awareness of the drive by a photographer to not to express something, but something is, I think I called it an affect drive. To put it that way, it's kind of sounds like a psychoanalytic term, but the affect, we know, is like the way that we are involuntarily affected by a picture or something. And what is it that makes a photographer take a picture of a particular thing? Okay, it might be a professional job, but within that, or outside of that, in personal photography, this, why is it when you're standing somewhere and you decide to take a picture? What is that? There's some sort of something that you may be consciously aware of, like, oh, that will make a really good picture. Or maybe something that's a bit vague and less clear. You think you just take a picture and maybe send it to people, Instagram, etc. And that itself is putting into circulation something which you started from something that you were kind of partially conscious of, a sort of affect drive. So it's difficult to say what that is exactly, because if you ask photographers, they're often defensive about what it is. Sometimes they might be explicit about it, but it isn't exactly what you're getting from the picture. There might be some gap between those things. But if
someone is always photographing skulls, David, would that be an example of the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yes. Well, anyone who's obsessed with any particular object, they're probably acutely aware that there's something going on. I mean, I've certainly had conversations with people not photographing skulls who are obsessed about particular things, and they're puzzled about why they're doing it, and that's why they continue doing it. And quite often a project finishes when you realize why you're doing it. That's the end of a project or a series. It's so interesting when you're looking through your own work or other people's work. Over a period of time, you start to see certain motifs that they're not conscious of. So you might say, you're photographing a lot of X or Y or Z. Yeah, I'm kind of aware of that. And this is the not so sort of professional language of presenting yourself, that there's a sort of emotional drive that is not really very conscious. I mean, it's easy to talk about the conscious things where somebody wants something, love, sex, a partner, or whatever, care, or all the kinds of things that happen in like personal photography and public social photography. But I'm talking about the kind of things that are less clearly spoken that drive certain drive people towards certain formats of photography, for example, certain shapes of picture even, or monochrome and color. I notice in the magazine there's a lot more monochrome around these days. And I noticed around undergraduate shows there's a lot of monochrome lately. Is that to do with some kind of cultural mood that the individuals are somehow picking up on? I'm sort of curious about these currents that float around in both sort of fashion and art and so forth that appear to sort of ebb and flow, and pretty much like news stories ebb and flow in similar ways.
We discussed what images would be suitable to discuss this hard to describe way in which a photographer may contribute to the emotional content of a picture. And we've got two examples here. And I think I was sort of thinking about how we talk about this picture. I think they rather complicate the picture, but this is Philip Halsman's picture of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And the reason it occurred to me, I think, as an example of what we're talking about, is that they were famously dull people. And he has brought his method to try and make an animated picture, which I think he also applied to pretty much anyone he photographed. His thing when he was taking a portrait photograph would get his subjects to jump. And even if it was a plank of wood, if you could get it to jump, it would look animated when you photographed it. And from what I gather, I don't really know very much about the Duke of Windsor, I'm afraid to say, but he seemed to be not an especially animated person. So the question comes about then as to the emotion that we might read into their faces or what they're doing. Is that really an artifact of what the photographer is doing, or maybe they're not really? I mean, maybe they're not really very emotional people, and the picture can only convey so much. What's your impression of this picture, David?
He was a notoriously dubious character, but I mean, yeah, it's the first one, right? It's a representation of emotions. He's trying to do something to make them, as you very clearly said, seem sort of interesting. And actually, she's smiling in quite a conventional way, and it's a weird picture. I didn't realize this was the one you were going to use, actually, but I must have been thinking of another one of his. But yeah, it's.
I think
it's very clearly a commercial job, and I don't think it's. It doesn't seem to have very much affect in any sort of way. I'm not sure that celebrity pictures do, particularly in that dimension. It's about the aura of the personality that is more important than their expression, I think, generally. This one
we came up with this picture as a contrast to this picture, in which they're doing the same thing, they're jumping, but it seems to be imbued with more of the spirit of the photographer. Yeah, it's so this is Lartigue's picture of his cousin Bichonard, and funnily enough, I noticed this while just making notes, that this picture was taken in 1904, which curiously is the year after the Frederick Evans steps, and it's hard to imagine a picture more different in character than the Wells Cathedral.
Well, I'm sure you know, and others know, that Lartigue was into speed. His shots of cars and stuff were kind of that era of the speed. It's kind of a thing, and the speedy woman is quite a positive image in some ways. I remember seeing this quite early on and being rather amazed by it, because technologically, to sort of freeze someone at that time, almost freezing them like that, quite a technological accompaniment. And what comes with that is, as we know from that kind of freezing of a rather decisive moment is the character who is frozen like that has a kind of gesture or bodily expression which we can invest in as an audience. And maybe this is what Lartigue knew in a way. It is precisely this, and this obviously predates the decisive moment notion in photography, but it was already there in theatre and painting before it, that you use the body as an expressive form. And that allows the pose, and particularly here, the feet off the ground, allows the spectator to run almost like a film. Their mind is like you could kind of wind your mind forward from this moment or backwards, you know, a bit like a kind of old 1904 film camera. You can wind it forward, back and forward in your mind, and thus the whole idea of the decisive moment is it triggers the imagination of the spectator to animate the image quite literally in their mind. And that is perhaps much more of a professional conceit than it is to do with a particular expressive emotional capacity. Except, you know, what would we say about movement as an emotion in that sense of the woman? It's kind of funny, not in a cruel way, but it's definitely a sort of emotional ambivalence to it in the way I think we're going to come to next.
I think in the, just to wind back a bit, so they're talking about emotion in photography conveyed by the photographer. I think it's very easy to think of examples in painting, someone like Edvard Munch or someone like this, where you can see that the style of the artist and a sort of pervasive emotion in their work is very directly connected to the life of the artist and what it is they're doing and the way their pictures look. But in photography, it's not quite so easy to think of photographers where you could say, I know what this artist's work looks like, and it always conveys a specific emotion that we associate with the photographer. But so I suppose I leave that question unanswered. But I think in the case of Lartigue, you've got someone whose work all seems very joyful. I mean, I haven't looked at all of his pictures, but and I'm wondering whether this is an example of somebody is jumping and it's associated with a kind of esprit. And it's not just about whether they're jumping or not, because in the Houseman picture, someone is jumping, but it's comparatively flat.
Yeah, no, I think you got it right there. This association of joy and jouissance and enjoyment in a way. Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of Munch and the screen, I just flashed back to the Dianaba's picture. Actually, I think that's quite close to that in some way. Yeah, I mean, anyway, I'll leave that there.
The last picture we're going to look at is this, and in a way we've returned to before the Kodak smile.
Yeah, well, this is the thing about particularly Nan Golding's work, is it seems to be photographically using those conventions of snapshots, yet it completely refuses at one level the visual content, if you like, of snapshots, and completely disturbs. So they have a kind of easy legibility, like snapshots in a way, because they're familiar. Yet the photographs she's chosen and the people presented are completely ambivalent or even ambiguous about what is going on here. Like, they're clearly looking at the camera stroke photographer. You know, it'd be hard, I think, I'm sure people can say what these people are, what the expressions on their face are, maybe I'm going to say, but they're hard to read. And that, I think, as I said earlier about art photography, it really draws you in. You have to look longer because you're trying to think about what's going on, what it's doing to me. What is this relation? It's like I'm there in a taxi because I'm in a position of the camera with these people. What is that relation? And I think that's part of the question of our project is what are these relations? And there's something sort of post-family snapshot photography about them, right? That as a cliche, family photography celebrates the joyous events of life, holidays, Christmas, and festivals of all kinds, and so forth, celebrated as happy events. And here we have events that it's uncertain what the emotional state of everybody is. And some of the pictures in the ballad of sexual dependency are quite brutal, yet they're also quite tender, and you're not really very clear what you're supposed to do with them. There's a lot about the pain of relationships and the way that the various configurations of Christ served in the religious world of the 15th and 16th centuries in a way. But these are much more obviously secular and to do with identity and sexuality. So yeah, this is the one I think where all of those three arenas kind of line up in quite interesting ways, because particularly with Nan Golding's project, the author is part of the work. We think of Nan Golding as a member of this community, and actually it's her camera looking, right? And so that's really kind of important.
Yes, you can't help noticing that what you've described about that picture is true of a lot of recent art photography, that often the subjects of modern art photography from the last 20 years are often, you might say, expressionless almost.
Yeah, hence, well, not expression. Yeah, I'm not sure it's expressionless. It's kind of not clear. And in the essay, my argument is that one of the arguments is that Dorothea Lange's photograph of the migrant mother, which I'm sure most of you would know that picture, is one where, if you like, the ideal picture of the mother, which was always like a happy, the mother with the child, the Madonna and child image, as a scene of happiness, is merged with the scene of photojournalism of pain, of people in distress. And in a way, that picture is so fascinating still, because it belongs to a cultural economy of happiness in its tradition, mother and child. But it's probably one of the first pictures that we're aware of anyway in history to then link that to a kind of distress. So it remains an iconic picture because of that. And so a lot of contemporary art photography, yeah, there was certainly a period of in advertising where people stopped smiling. Various people written about that. So I mean, the 1990s, so a lot of models, famous models who pout, who didn't even pout, who just looked really like hostile. So the kind of new attitude, you could see that. So these all have their currents, right? If you like, the kind of river of expressive culture in different cultures. But we shouldn't just reduce the question of expressions to that set of conventions. I'm trying to, in the essay, I mean, even if people don't agree with the argument, trying to tease out a whole number of issues that we just, I don't think, have thought about carefully enough. And so probably the essay is a sketch for a whole bunch of other things that could be written about these things, both the sort of affect drive of a photographer, the notion of affect, which is there in classic literature on photography, like Cameron of Cedar from ages ago, but is kind of dated in some ways in where it's argued. And
just David, just to mention that. Okay, so in a minute we'll just ask people if anybody has any questions, and we can have a few minutes to see if anybody wants to add their own thoughts to this. But just before we do that, I had one more question, which was, what are the consequences of getting these things mixed up? So we've talked about how we engage with the emotional expression that someone's wearing in a photograph, and we've talked about how you could look at a picture like Frederick Evans and feel about it a certain way, and the way that a photographer may imbue a picture with a certain emotion. What happens if you get these things mixed up? I mean, the purpose of your essay is to sort of clarify these things. Are there places where this gets muddled and it has a consequence?
Yeah, well, most of the time, probably, that we all do that all the time. And one of the reasons for writing it, trying to sort of sort out in my own mind, how might we advance discussion of emotions? Because I'm very acutely aware of how difficult it can be to try and talk about them, even though we're all encouraged to be, have emotional intelligence these days and be expressive of our states. And what you're doing is, violating my sense of well-being, and so therefore you need to modify your behaviour. All this kind of culture that we now live in. So I mean, I think, yeah, the answer to that question is the point of maybe not criticism but theory would be to try to unpick these aspects, to make the distinction so that we can understand how and where they operating as photographers, as citizens, but particularly as photographers and people who are involved in photography, to understand the dynamics of them. So it's then for me useful as a sort of analytic tool. So I mean, for anybody, you can, when you feel moved by something, just stop and look at the picture again and say to yourself, where has that come from? Is it something that's been pointed out to me by the picture, like somebody expressing something in a particular way? Or is it something that I am investing in this picture? That is already, it seems to me, quite, and of course that's complicated because it's actually quite hard to separate those things sometimes. It's one of the things we try to do in education, is to distinguish between, what is kind of there in the picture, and, if you like, to take an objective position to our own subjectivity, so that subjectivity in our emotional states can be unpacked. That's precisely what psychotherapy or all those things spend a lot of time trying to do. And it's no coincidence a lot of that language has kind of passed into everyday language, like, we must move on, give it some closure, you're in denial. All of these things come from classic psychology and psychotherapy. So it is important, when someone says, I have a really bad feeling about this. Well, you're having the bad feeling, but where has it come from? Is it come from you, or has it come from the other thing that is making you feel to have a bad thing? Or conversely, I have a really good feeling about this. Well, where does that come from? What is it doing here? It's that kind of relation, I think, that is kind of the more difficult thing to unpack, exactly where it comes from. So that was the point of having this tripartite distinction. And I'm not sure if your question was meant to lead me to the comment in the essay about Susan Sontag's book on the pain of others, which is a fascinating book about photographs of pain in a way. But I think she quite simply confuses these three areas together. That is, one, the representation of emotions by a picture, the effect of that picture on a particular spectator, and thirdly, the affect drive of the photographer. She confuses all of those things. And if you're trying to work through an ethics or a morality of some kind of photography that she is in the essay, that becomes a deep problem because you don't know where anything is from. But I'm aware of time, so that's in the essay.
Yeah, well, hopefully your provocation about Susan Sontag will prompt people to
a flood of criticism, probably.
Okay, so yes, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask David, if you could put your hand up by means of the miracles of Zoom, or if you want to write them in the chat. And just while you're doing that, I'm going to ask a supplementary question, which is, David, do you enjoy being moved by photographs?
Yeah, I do. I do. I'm often moved by this one, partly because she's one of the only women in this room of the great and good of this university. But the sort of cheeky smile on her face, it's not a great. None of these are great photographs. They're kind of standard commercial, some photographer did, but isn't this the thing? One of the pleasures of photography is what the photographer put there isn't necessarily the enjoyment or whatever emotional thing it is I get from it. And this also we have to recognize as photographers as well. And I think, you hear a lot of photographers say, once you put your work into the public world, you no longer control it, and you can't control it because people will do with it whatever they want. And that's one of the great pleasures of it.
Colin, who is a contributor to this issue, so is just the right person to contribute at this moment, has asked, Colin Gray, I should say, who has a portfolio in this issue, has asked the question in the chat. The last is there now more emotion in the art form? Now we have more female practitioners.
No.
You must have taught many generations of students, and I'm guessing there are a lot more female students now than there were probably when you started teaching. Would that be true?
That's very true. Yes, yeah. It is. Yes.
But do you think that's changed the character of the work that's produced?
Well, I suppose I said no abruptly because maybe behind that question, I'm probably wrong, but maybe behind that question is the popular assumption that women are more emotional than men, which I would sort of reject. So I will have a hysterical fit in a minute, so you'll just to prove the case. But what we're talking about here isn't only in photography, is it? It's cultural studies has been acutely aware of how politics is dominated in a way by emotions now, much more than ever before. So it's the kind of this, one of the things I mentioned much earlier is the sense that emotional intelligence is being used by corporations, cyber intelligence organizations, and so on. It's become a political tool. And so if art has always had this dimension of, well, actually, I say always, it's probably relatively recent, since the 18th century. In fact, one of the points is that paintings were not expressive. If you said you were expressing something in the 15th century, you would have been burnt as a heretic, because what you were really doing was God's work by painting Christ on the cross or whatever. This was divined that you should do this, not you're expressing yourself. That's like a heretical position, right? So the growth of emotion in culture is everywhere. So you can find essays or books on the cultural politics of emotion, which deals with hate and happiness as forms of cultural politics. And this is completely everywhere. So yeah, maybe I'm oversensitive to the dynamics of gender distribution within the arts. But it's not like there's a kind of feminine touch that has transformed the art world into being more emotionally intelligent or sensitive. There's emotion here already. You know, maybe what you're getting at is a kind of liberation in UK culture to some extent from its constraints of these people who were confined within certain parameters of expression of their feeling. And you know, personally, I'd say that was to do with the collapse in authority of most of our major institutions. That in a sense, that you know, one of the dangers of expressive culture is it's very difficult to have a serious conversation with people who are hell-bent on exerting some kind of revenge on you. Anyway, aware I'm speaking far too long. Let me stop there.
No, that's very interesting. I think we'll probably wrap up there. It's been fascinating talking to you, David. I think in a way we've only scratched the surface, and to have the opportunity to sit down and have a considered response to David's piece, I recommend reading it in the magazine. It's a nicely argued and concise way of dealing with a tricky subject that isn't often dealt with, and I think it will be well worth your time to sit and consider it. And I think the rest of the magazine as well complements it in a way that I wouldn't have expected. And you get to see a photograph of my cat. So that's pretty much everyone's
Is your cat in the Cats essay?
Yes, my cat is in the Cats essay. Did I not mention that already? I assumed I've been thinking about it all day. I assumed that I would have said that straight at the start.
Cat.
My cat is now famous and will become even more insufferable. So thank you, David. Thank you,
Richard,
for coming.
For coming. It's very kind of you all to come.
And enjoy the magazine, and we'll post this discussion on our YouTube channel so you can have a look at it if you want to review some of what we've said. And I hope I see you again at the next launch. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.